Now, what are companies doing to improve access? Well, a good example is Debenhams, the retailer, has signed a formal agreement with the Disability Rights Commission to provide disabled access in all its retail stores in the UK. And this commits Debenhams to having in place suitable means for disabled access to previously inaccessible mezzanine floor areas in its stores. They found that some people couldn't get onto mezzanine floors, and what they found was that they decided to make all their mezzanine floors accessible to people with disabilities. Basically, they're going to have access platforms, and these will be fitted in all of their stores. So what has changed with the Equality Act then? Well, previously, adjustments to premises and to policies, practices and procedures had to be made by service providers only where it was otherwise be impossible or unreasonably difficult for a disabled person to use the service. Now, under the Equality Act, adjustments must be made where disabled people experience a substantial disadvantage. Understand? Now, a substantial disadvantage. And this means that service providers may have to make more adjustments. Also, it was previously possible for a service provider to legally justify failing to provide a reasonable adjustment in certain circumstances. Now, the only question is whether the adjustment is a reasonable one to make. So now that's the key. The only question is whether now the adjustment is a reasonable one to make. Let's look now at another case of harassment now. Let's expand on harassment. Now, disability harassment is unwanted behaviour related to disability that has the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for them. Now, for example here, someone attends a day centre for adults with learning difficulties. Some of the staff make fun of him by mimicking him. He could make a claim for harassment related to disability because they're trying to mimic him, they're basically taking him. That is discrimination. So what's new? Well, protection from disability-related harassment in services is new. Yeah, that's why it's in services now. It also applies to services. I mean, victimisation. It is unlawful victimisation for a service provider to treat someone badly because they have made a complaint about discrimination or harassment under the Act, or if they've helped somebody else make a complaint, or because the service provider thinks that they're going to do these things. This applies whether or not the person being victimised is disabled. So you don't even have to be disabled, it's still victimisation. Now, a person is not protected from victimisation if they have maliciously made or supported an untrue complaint. So there is a difference. An example of this. If one of the staff at a day centre supports somebody to make a complaint about harassment and as a consequence they are ostracised by their manager, that is victimisation. So you can't ostracise somebody because they help somebody make a claim against the organisation. Now, there is now no need for a victim to show that they have been treated less favourably than someone who has not made or supported a complaint under the Act. They only need to show that they have been treated badly. So on this point now, what do you need to know now? Well, voluntary and community organisations will want to ensure that all the staff, including the volunteers, understand the new Act. You will be held responsible for all acts of discrimination, harassment or victimisation by those working on your behalf, unless you can show that you took all reasonable steps to prevent them. So you've got to educate your staff on the provisions of the Equality Act. And as a matter of good practice, such steps might include informing your staff and management committee of the new provisions, reviewing regularly whether your services are accessible to disabled people, providing regular training to staff, implementing your equality policy and reviewing its effectiveness, having an easy-to-use, well-publicised complaints procedure and using this to identify problems that need to be addressed. So in your policy, if you've got this problem, address the problem. Consulting disabled customers, organisations representing disabled people and staff about the quality and equality of your services and how they could be made more inclusive. So ask for advice. This is an example here of how could a person in a wheelchair gain access to a bench of a meal. This is a good example. There you go, another example. Small organisations may find a less formal approach more sufficient, such as talking to the staff and service users, thinking about whether services are being used by disabled people and considering whether there are any reasonable adjustments that actually they need to make. Now this is a good example of a facility here to allow someone in a wheelchair to be allowed to go fishing. And again here, look at this facility here for a coach, access for a wheelchair to get onto a coach. And here is a lift to gain access to upper floors. These are all examples that used to be things you should be doing. So do you understand? This information's got to get across to all employees. You've got to let people know what this act is all about. Now, this is all about getting people in. You should make inclusive design. You've got to get people in the building. But what is equally as important is how are you going to get them out in an emergency? Or what provision are you going to put in place to ensure their safety in the event of an emergency? That's the area I'm going to cover now, is disabled egress now, how to get people out. First of all, a legal overview. Now, the fire service's role in fire evacuation is ensuring that means of escape in case of fire and associated fire safety measures provided for all people who may be in a building are both adequate and reasonable, taking into account the circumstances of each particular case. Now, under current fire safety legislation, it's the responsibility of the person having responsibility for the building, in other words, the nominated responsible person, to provide a fire safety risk assessment that includes an emergency evacuation plan for all people likely to be on the premises, and this has got to include disabled people and how that plan is going to be implemented. Now, the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 and associated regulations are relevant to issues regarding manual handling by staff members and the general safety of employees, visitors and other persons. So this does come into it. If you are going to get people out, manual handling techniques have to be used in safely. Now, such an evacuation plan should not rely upon the fire brigade. That's a key to this. Everyone just says, no, we'll leave the people in the refuge for the fire brigade. It's not. You should not rely on the fire brigade. The fire brigade could be an incident on the motorway somewhere. You can't totally rely on the fire brigade. Your plan should not include total reliance on the fire brigade. And any issues you may want to discuss with the fire brigade, you can, but you can't just say, point blank, it's the fire brigade, not their job. Now, in the case of multi-occupancy buildings, responsibility may rest with a number of people for each occupying organisation and with the owners of the building. And it's important that they cooperate and coordinate evacuation plans. So if you've got a building with 16 storeys and there's 15 different, get together. Well, you could share evacuation strategies, you could share evacuation chairs. Do you see what I mean? Talk to each other. Now, this could present a particular problem in multi-occupied buildings when the different escape plans and strategies need to be coordinated from a central point. So if you've got a multi-occupancy building, it's better to have one plan on for everybody rather than have your own little plan, some evacuation chairs, some evacuation mats, and some just don't do any evacuation at all. Now, where an employer or a service provider does not make provision for the safe evacuation of disabled people from its premises, that is viewed as discrimination. That is discrimination. It may also constitute a failure to comply with the fire regulations, because don't forget, you've got to consider everyone in the building, even people with disabilities. Now, the Equality Act requires organisations to review their policies, practices and procedures in order to ensure that they do not discriminate against disabled people and that they take steps to overcome any physical barriers that make it impossible or unreasonably difficult to use a service. So you've got to do that. Well, how do you manage this? The management then. Now, operational procedures, for example, those that require all visitors to park away from a building, have had to be amended to allow disabled people to park close to the main entrance. Equally, the practice of locking the side swing door adjacent to a revolving door is likely to be unlawful under this part of the Act. You can't do that. Yeah, it's got to be accessible. You've got your revolving doors. You've got to have your door at the side. Such an act may also constitute an offence under the current fire regulations because they need to get out. They can't get out through a revolving door in a wheelchair, can they? So do you understand? That's got to be not only to get in, to get out. That's what I'm saying. There's an interaction here between getting in and getting out. Now, these are examples of how the Equality Act changed how companies manage public access. Now these pictures now will show you how the Equality Act changed how people manage public access. Yeah, to get people into a swimming pool, 2 good examples there. However, attention, like I say, is focused on getting people in, when of course it's going to be to ensure they get out that's important as well. The safe evacuation of disabled people is a problematic area for policymakers and one that has not yet received sufficient attention to date. It's important that both building managers and disabled people understand that planning for means of escape is about planning for exceptional circumstances. In other words, not an everyday event. When writing your plans, escape plans that include disabled people, there's a tendency to overplay the safety issue to the detriment of the independence and the dignity of disabled people. And it should also be remembered that when a disabled person, what they're prepared to do in an exceptional circumstance, in other words, when there's a fire, for example, may differ significantly from what they can reasonably manage in their everyday activities. Escape plans for disabled people should be prepared with a view that what is required is for the real thing. The level of effort required of a disabled person may not be acceptable for a practice or a false alarm, or in everyday activities. You know, that's a big issue. Should you get people in evacuation chairs out when you're doing a fire drill in a practice? Well, there's guidance says you should, some says you shouldn't. Well, the problem you've got is now, if you do a fire drill and you're taking someone out in a wheelchair, evacuation chair, and you injure that person, well, there'll be someone's to blame for that, aren't there? Was it required? Did you have to do that during that drill? In other words, is it necessary to put that person at risk to do a drill? Now, in a real fire, you might have to do it. Yeah, if you've got to do it, you've got to do it. You're willing to take the risk. Be very careful when you're doing fire drills on whether or not you start to practice using evacuation chairs during fire drills and who you use. Now, the health and safety of an officer I was talking to organised a fire drill. And what he did was, part of the fire drill, on this evacuation for this particular area, he had evacuation chairs. He thought, well, we'll have a bit of a practice with evacuation chairs. He used trained staff. They've been trained. One person got in the chair, one didn't. They took the person down the stairs in the evacuation chair. By the time they got to the bottom of that stairs, the person in the evacuation chair went, oh, my back. Oh, I think my back in doing that exercise. Oh, and they took off 6 months off sick. They were off for 6 months. The trainer was suspended from work because he did a drill and he used an evacuation chair. Now, really, did he do anything wrong? In my opinion, he was trying to make it more realistic. However, what happened? Well, he was suspended from work. So it's a bit of a warning there. Be very careful. You've got to justify what you're doing. You've got to justify it. Now, the procedures put in place should take into account of this and allow for simulation in the case of fire drills and other emergency evacuations. So they do say, try and bring it in. Try and make it realistic. However, some people, disabled people, are put at great risk when carried out techniques of any kind are used, and it's therefore necessary for the evacuation policy to include a method of reducing the need for it, especially during, for example, a false alarm or a fire drill. So if the alarm goes off, it might be an idea to use the refuge as a temporary area while you find out if it's a false alarm. If it is a false alarm, then you don't have to move the person. Because I've had courses where people have said, as soon as the alarm goes off, they should be down the stairs. Get them out of the building. Well, if you've got refuges, should you need to do that? Or is it safer to put a person in a refuge, a temporary holding area, let people get out the building, reassure the person they're all right, give them some communication, then decide whether or not, if it's confirmed fire, you may decide to move them. Now, it's more likely that more disabled people will be willing to facilitate their own escape when they know it's not going to be required of them during a practice or a false alarm. In other words, they may agree, well, in a real fire, don't you worry, mate, I'll help you out. Yeah? Rather than, I'm not going to do that for false alarms or drills because it's painful to do that or it's dangerous. So let's look at the issue of reducing unnecessary escapes then. Good communication with disabled people about the fire or emergency evacuation process is vital to ensure its success and reduce the need for emergency escapes except in exceptional circumstances. Again, just setting the alarm off in a building with a person that's less abled, they may injure themselves going down the stairs because they thought it was the real thing, they might go down the stairs. If it's a fire drill, you might want to inform them first. I mean, all this for evacuation, you've got to carry out what we call a PEEPs and JEEPs. A PEEP is a personal emergency evacuation plan and a JEEP is a generic emergency evacuation plan. JEEP should be carried out in public buildings when you don't know who's going to come in. So it's generic. You might say a person comes in, a wheelchair comes in, someone comes in with a hearing impairment. That's called a JEEP. A PEEP is a personal emergency evacuation plan. Now, These evacuation plans explain the method of evacuation to be used by that particular disabled person in each area of a building. And it should not be assumed that a person is disabled that they will ask for a PEEP. So they're not always going to ask you for a PEEP. If it's quite clear the person's got a disability, then you interview and you find out how you can assist that person out of the building. Now, some will be confident that they can get out of the building unaided. I don't need you to help me, I'll be all right. Also, it should not be assumed that people with hidden impairments such as a heart condition or epilepsy, or who would normally not have an access problem, might require assistance in emergency evacuations. Now, the following principles should guide the preparation and implementation of a PEEP. Now, you've got to look in your workplace and you've got to look, have you got PEEPs in place or have you got the facility? Now, the same rules of courtesy and respect apply to disabled and non-disabled people alike. Disabled people should not be treated as a health and safety problem to be resolved. It's not a health and safety problem to be resolved. See the person, not the disability. Now, needs and preferences vary widely between individuals. Disabled people should be meaningfully involved at all stages in the development and review of their PEEP. In other words, don't just do a PEEP and say, we've done this for you. Discuss the PEEP with them. Which method would you prefer? Which would you be more comfortable with? Now, in an evacuation, ask. Don't assume when determining what assistance a person might need. Don't just grab them out of the wheelchair. Get in here, we're going to, all right, get out. Wait there a minute, I'm all right. Do you know what I mean? Don't just do that. The individual disabled person best understands the nature of his or her impairment. So discuss. For an example of this then, a health club has a regular member who finds the stairs difficult. During their induction, the fitness instructor discusses their escape needs. Now that there's an evacuation chair provided there, and all you do is you make sure that all the instructors are trained in the use of the chair and they are introduced to the member. So that's what you cover in that health club. So hello, this is Johnny, he may need some assistance. If he does need assistance, we've got an evacuation chair, you know, and the staff are trained. That's what you can do in that health club.